Check it out.
Friends and enemies, lovers and haters, welcome to Sends and Suffers podcast. I am your host, Mario Stanley. If you haven't already, please follow, like, and subscribe to Sends and Suffers podcast. Every bit counts, and we would love to hear from you, so take a moment to leave a comment. These go a long way and help others know what they're getting into and how good this show is. If this is one of your favorite podcasts, consider becoming a Patreon. For as little as $5 a month, you are investing in Sends and Suffers podcast, and it's like buying your boy a taco, hanging out, and getting to know the good that is coming your way. Monthly recaps, early show releases, and all the other cool things that we do. Thank you so much for listening to Sends and Suffers podcasts.
The official sponsor of Sends and Suffers podcast is Organic Climbing. From crash pads, chalk buckets, chalk bags, fanny packs, their drip is on fire. And let me tell you, with absolute utter certainty in my voice, there is no greater feeling when you are coming down from your high ball or the heavens above. Let me tell you, of seeing an organic crash pad underneath your feet, you will rise to the occasion or feel comfortable coming down from that occasion. Use Sends and Suffers in your next purchase, get 10% off, and support someone who supports this podcast. Organic Climbing is really, honestly, one of the best companies in the climbing industry as a whole. So let's get into our episode today. Mr. Alan Watts, the man, the myth, the legend. I mean, some people call him the Godfather of sport climbing in America, but I would say he's just a man that loves rock climbing, and he needs rock climbing more than rock climbing needs him. And that's a beautiful thing because he knows where he finds joy in his life. I want you to enjoy this episode with Alan Watts. When I was at CWA earlier this year, him and I had a chance to sit down and have a chat about his life, climbing, and what he's seen and where he sees it going. Please enjoy this episode of Sends and Suffers podcast with Alan Watts. Alan, how are you?
I'm doing well.
All right. Welcome to Sends and Suffers podcast. I'm excited to talk to you today.
I am very excited too. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. So I'm not going to assume that everyone knows who you are, where you're from, and what you've done. So who are you? Where are you from? And I guess what is your connection to the outdoors and to CWA of what we're doing here?
Yeah, I've been around for a long time. My name is Alan Watts. I've been climbing for almost 50 years, actually rock climbing. I live in Oregon. I live in Bend, Oregon now, just about 45 miles from where I grew up, about 20 miles from Smith Rock. And so most of my climbing life has been centered around the climbing at Smith Rock. And I've traveled all over and worked in the industry, got out of the industry, but climbing has continued to just be a common thread for most of my life.
Okay.
I didn't even know. I'm here with Edelrid, just kind of as an ambassador. And when Blair asked me about coming to the show, I'll have to admit I did not even know the show existed. So
CWA is kind of like, it's the niche within niche of rock climbing.
I mean, it makes sense that it had to exist because climbing walls and climbing gyms, exploded so much. And I left the industry. I was founder and president of Entreprise until 1997. And so I hadn't been to a trade show since 1997. And to be gone for that long and all of a sudden just come back 25 years later and look around, it's like, oh my God, what has happened? Because, there were like 3 or 4 hold companies maybe back then. And now there's 34 or even more than that here.
Wow. I didn't know you founded Entreprise. What started that?
Well, Entreprise already existed in France.
Okay.
And I was working for Metolius in Bend, and we started, along with a couple partners, we started the U.S. division of Entreprise, which was just called Entreprise USA in 1988. And trying to, we had we each chipped in some money, and the French partners chipped in the molds and the technology. And so we had these holds, and we started making holds and entire climbing wall systems, panel systems that would fit together, and tried to sell them to people back before there was a time where anybody knew what climbing walls were. And usually the main question you'd get would be, why? What? Climbing walls for, why would... And nobody even knew what it was.
That makes sense.
So it was kind of a tough business, and there were just starting to be climbing gyms, but they were all do-it-yourself sort of things. The earliest climbing gyms didn't even have modular holds. They were just rocks glued on, like the vertical,
I remember that.
Vertical World. And so, the industry didn't exist. And it was tough for, the climbing gyms were small. All the early climbing gyms, people, they struggled. They weren't, they were people, it was a labor of love. I'd have friends who would say, hey, I'm starting a climbing gym in Eugene. And I'd always feel like giving them a hug. Like, oh, I'm sorry. That's going to be tough.
Oh my God.
And so then I left in 97, and my French partner, he left also. So everybody that was there from the very start at Entreprise, we all went our separate ways, and it was acquired by another company. And then I don't know exactly when it happened. I've been asking people, like, when did it take off? When did it just explode like climbing gyms? Because now it's just
Snowbird.
Unbelievably massive.
I would say Snowbird.
Snowbird when?
Snowbird, when they had the last competition that they had outdoors, and I think it was Snowbird. I think the X Games may have been a part of that, but it was like the wall was strapped onto the side of a hotel building.
Yeah, and I set routes for the first Snowbird.
The last one that ever happened.
I think 1988 when I did that.
So like the last one happened, I think in the late 90s.
Okay.
That was when Tommy and Hans were both like still competing in it. And I mean, I think that's when, correct me if I'm wrong, but like it was either that event or maybe something right before that or after that. But like it was covered by X Games, which was also put out by ESPN.
Right. I remember
and from that moment, I think that's when the tide shifted, because by no means, I believe whatever event I'm thinking about, and I might not be right, but that's when it turned into a trickle, but like a little trickle from a faucet into like a steady, small, consistent stream. Because from that moment on, like you hear of things, because then from that moment on, you hear of all kinds of crazy things. Like I think shortly a year after that, Chris Sharma blew up. He was in, Men's Magazine. He was in GQ and Rolling Stones.
Sure. Yeah.
Then you had you started having people. I mean, I think that's also too when like a lot more climbing films started coming out. I mean, this was like, I think Return to Sender is older than that. I
mean, probably early 2000s, maybe. I met Chris in 1997 when he was 16 years old at Smith.
So I would probably say early 2000s because that's when like USA Climbing and everything was like really starting to pick up steam, and like these climbing organizations, and that's when you start having gyms. So like, probably the early 2000s. But I think that last event, because there's like so many moments that I've talked to people over the years that trace it back to around Snowbird or some kind of outdoor competition that was really picked up. Because I just remember I wish I remember who I was talking to. It's not someone I've done a podcast with, but they were talking about, it was climbing, it was like snowboarding and skateboarding, or skateboarding and some other thing else. And I'm like, oh, it was the X Games. They're like, no, I don't think it was the X Games, but it was something that was publicized. And to you, what you just said, it was like around then in the 2000s, like it just like started exploding. And it just, I don't think it hit its heyday until around 2010. And then that's like when things got insane.
And that in 1997, when I left the industry, I had a 4-year-old son. My daughter was born in 1997, and my life just went a complete different direction.
Oh, wow.
I started climbing at Smith Rock in 75. And so I'd already put in more than a 20-year career of climbing. First a traditional climber, and then developing sport climbing in the United States at Smith, and then working in the industry. And I was just kind of done. It was like, hey, this was great. But I don't think the climbing gym industry is really ever going to go anywhere. I just guessed. Yeah, I was not right.
No.
And
thank God you didn't gamble on that one.
and really, so I was doing completely different things. Didn't pick up a climbing magazine for probably a decade, and then I started to. I released another guidebook to Smith Rock, and I was just kind of getting. There was a gym in Bend where I live that was a pretty good gym, and I just kind of started going back, and I was like falling off of 5'10", climbing at the gym after being away for so long, and I'd put on a bunch of weight, and then I realized I'm having just as much fun, even though I suck right now. I'm having just as much fun climbing as I ever did before. Yeah. So I came back into like, okay, what's going on with climbing now? And I just was kind of blown away by just. That's when I first realized, like, whoa, this thing has become a big thing.
Yeah. Rock climbing's a thing. I'll say that when I started my career, I started out in a gym that was a glorified woody, and it was dirty, polished walls. There was no texture.
And that's every gym started that way.
Yeah.
Back in the 90s, and the early gyms were all just, they were not nice.
Yeah. I remember like when we would reset routes, like we would drop the entire rope side and the bouldering side and swap holds so the routes would seem really new. Right. Like we could drop the whole gym. Like when I very first started, we could drop the whole gym and reset the whole thing in a day. And it's like, cause there was only like maybe 5 routes on per wall. And I remember when we spent like $5,000 on holds and people were looking at us like, you guys have 9 routes per wall, 10 routes per wall. It's like so crowded. And now you look at it, there's like 14 routes. Sure. It's like, it's like, oh, our gym holds a consistent of 2,000 routes all the time. And I'm like, it's a different world. But yeah, you are correct. Climbing is utterly exploded.
Yeah, it's been pretty cool for me just being like from the early 70s to now. I mean, because I've seen, when I was starting to climb, there was not even any sport climbing, certainly no competitions. There was traditional climbing, big walls, free climbing, but not, climbing was pretty simple.
So kind of segueing into that, like your story of bolting one of the very first sport routes, or was it the first sport route in Smith?
Well, at Smith, Smith was the first place in the United States, the first sport crag. Mm-hmm. And kind of looking back at it, you realized, okay, well, this is the first place. And I was the only one doing development back then. So yeah, I did the first sport climbs in the United States, not calling them sport climbs. It was just, I saw these routes that had to be climbed, and I knew that I couldn't climb them, from the ground up, putting in bolts. And it was almost nobody climbed there. And it was the routes that just kind of forced me to break the rules and start bolting. And I didn't care. I knew it was not what was done. It wasn't accepted style in, Yosemite or in Colorado or whatever, but I didn't really care. It's like, this is just my little home crag. Nobody's here. I just want to climb these routes.
That's kind of cool. I've heard a story. I was listening to like Alex Honnold's podcast, Climbing Gold, and I heard a story about like a couple who started doing the same thing in Vegas, and it's like people were like, what do you mean you're putting bolts in? Like you can't, like people were like, you can't do that. And like, right. And I think I don't know, I always find it kind of funny that people would tell you that you can't do that, because that seems like very counterintuitive to the very nature and the spirit of climbing in general. It's like, well, it's not about what I can and cannot do. It's about like, how can I just get up this wall and not trash the whole place, but at the same time, like, how can I just get up this route or get up this thing? And I always found that funny that people would just immediately tell you, like, this is not how things are done. When I'm sure that same conversation has been happening forever. When people started putting in passive, like active and passive hardware, people were like, no, you can't do that.
Sure. So any change, people tend to resist. And fortunately for me, Smith Rock was so isolated, just in the middle of nowhere. Nobody really went there. There was nobody to tell me no. And, there was nobody saying, hey, what you're doing is not cool. You can't be bolting, or you can't be hang dogging was a big thing where you'd hang on the rope. And it's hard to imagine now, but if you didn't, traditional style, you fell off, you lowered down, you weren't feeling the holds, you weren't figuring out the sequence. You lowered off and then pulled your rope and started all over again. So what I was doing at Smith Rock, it wasn't like that radical of a thing. It was just common sense. But it wasn't until I was traveling, because I still travel a lot to Yosemite, and I did I was doing their routes. And it's one thing I never expected is when you can rappel bolt stuff and start, hang dogging and working on them as boulder problems, really, it makes it safer and you can push yourself way harder. And I was getting good because for a couple years, I was like the only one in the US who was sport climbing. Everybody else was trad climbing. And so I got pretty good, and I was going to Yosemite and I was doing their hardest free routes. And it's like, these are not that hard. And that's when, they're not that hard, but you're not really doing them because you're cheating. You're falling off and hanging and figuring out moves. And it's like, well, yeah, but I red pointed it. I put in all the gear, and it's like, it doesn't matter. You still cheated.
Oh.
So and so then that's where if I had just stayed isolated at Smith Rock, if I hadn't actually become a pretty good climber and went elsewhere and started doing some of their hardest routes and even some routes they hadn't done before, nobody really would have noticed. But that kind of created controversy.
I could see that because, if you're just showing up, falling, hang dogging, putting together moves, figuring things out, and then eventually you come down and setting the whole thing, people are just probably up in arms about the whole thing. And also, climbing is an inherently selfish sport sometimes, and a lot of people's egos, and I can imagine that just set some people off.
Oh, it set people off. It was hard it was really uncomfortable, some of the conversations I'd have.
Did you ever get into any conflicts or altercations almost?
I had people in my face yelling at me and, with spittle flying out of their mouth. Really mad.
Wow.
Yeah. But by that point, I was pretty confident. I knew there was something, I had an ego too. And it was whatever, I did your hardest route. And so just that you're still working on. And so it was just I don't really care what you say. And, it was kind of a heady time where it was this was working. I didn't see that this was going to lead to something in the future, and there were going to be other sport climbing areas. Again, somebody else came up with that name, but, I didn't really imagine what would come in the future. It was just kind of self-motivated. I want to climb these lines and I want to get as good as I can get.
So
Very simple.
What was the name of the first route that you just bolted?
I bolted something that came to be known as Watts Tots, which was right next to a climb called Tater Tots. And so that's where the name came. It just rhymed. And
Watts Tots.
And then there's but a week later I did Chain Reaction, which is this overhanging arête that is, pretty much everybody has seen a picture of it. Rumor has it that was the inspiration for the Cliff Bar, the wrapper on the Cliff Bar.
Oh.
Yeah, that's kind of what it looks like. So yeah, one of the most photographed routes in the world. And a picture of that climb with me on that climb got into a mountain magazine in England, which was at the time probably the biggest climbing magazine in the world. And so all of a sudden there was international exposure for Smith Rock, and people started coming. It went from there being almost nobody there to the next spring after all these magazines came out. I remember walking down through the park and there were probably 50 climbers, and I walked from one end to the other and I realized I am the only person speaking English. So that was it. It happened so quickly.
Wow. That blows my mind. I was expecting for you to just there's 50 people over there. But when you said only speaking English, that's kind of cool. The first real explosion of that whole area, it was not Americans, but it was foreigners coming over and just
the Americans came too, and
but not as much. I'm assuming.
Well, they still came. There were more Americans, I think, than foreigners. But the fact that it was in European magazines. Climbing was bigger there. It was just a bigger sport. And it was. And yeah, so, and they were coming over and they were better than we were. The first 514 was done, a route that I had worked on in 1984, but it was done in 1986 by Jean-Baptiste Trabou, a French climber. So
I know that name.
Yeah. So, And again, once, that route's done, and then there's 514 and there's all these 513s and harder and harder and harder routes, eventually the voices in the traditional areas that were saying, no, you can't do what you're doing, they just disappeared. And you started to have climbers who were previously traditional climbers kind of step over and start sport climbing. And then now it's just people who are interested in history, like relatively ancient history now, know the story about how that all unfolded. But then that led to, there were the whole sport climbing movement kind of led to, first off in Europe, climbing competitions that were outdoors. I went to one in the Pyrenees in 1986 and competed in the Rock Masters in Arco in 87. And it just kind of took off. And then the gyms and, it all kind of grew out of sport climbing, but it just grew these directions that are, there's no way to say that, starting sport climbing in the United States, that's why gyms happened, but it played a little role. It was like, gyms didn't grow out of traditional climbing.
No, I think sport climbing and bouldering are quintessentially the reason why gyms exist really well, because the barrier to entry to sport climbing and bouldering is so low to just get into, like monetarily and really what you've got to do. Like I remember my first trad rack, it was all Metolius. I bought the whole thing from them, but I had to spend like $500 of my own money that I saved up in my entire tax return to get my first rack.
Oh yeah.
And I didn't even have a rope. I just bought the rack. And then I was just like, there was a buddy I knew who sport climbed, and I was just like, I'll teach you how to trad climb if we can use your rope. And he was like, do you even know how to trad climb? I'm like, I know how to trad climb more than you, so we'll just figure it out. And
back then that's kind of what we all did. We all just figured it out.
Yeah. So, man, that's wild. So, okay. So if we can back up just a hair, how did you actually get into rock climbing?
My dad climbed.
Okay.
He climbed mountains, and he actually did a couple first ascents at Smith Rock, the year I was born, 1960. So he didn't really climb at Smith Rock very much. He mainly just started, he was climbing in the mountains, doing the Oregon Cascades, hiking up the volcanoes there. And so I think I was 8 years old when I did my first 10,000 foot mountain. So that's just kind of what the family did. And Smith Rock, I knew it was just, it was 20 miles away. We visited it it's a place where we'd go for picnics or hikes. There were pretty much no climbers. But since my dad climbed, he subscribed to a climbing magazine back in the 60s called Summit. It was like the only climbing magazine really in the United States. And he had books about the conquest of Everest. And I just started looking through the magazines. And when I was 10 years old, I started actually buying some climbing gear. Like, not even, just like, this is something I want to do. So by the time I first visited Smith, I already had a rope, I had a harness, I had a whole bunch of gear. I just didn't have any way to get there because my dad wasn't climbing at that point.
Okay.
And so I met a person in high school who was older, and he had a copy of Royal Robbins' book called Basic Rockcraft, which every climber used back then. And I went up to him, and even though he was older, I got up the courage, and it's like, hey, you must be a climber. And he's like, yeah, I've climbed at Smith Rock, and you ought to come along. And so anyway, that's how it started.
Okay.
It was very hard to get in climbing back then because there were no gyms, there weren't classes.
No, you had to meet someone, or you had to know the guy who knew the guy who had the paper cop.
Yeah, there had to be a connection. And I with my dad and just being close to Smith Rock. And that's the way it unfolded.
Yeah, I'm happy it's not that way anymore.
Oh, yeah.
Very much so. Because it was, I think also too, because I kind of came into it, it wasn't quite that way, but if you wanted to go outside, it was still that way a little bit. And even in Texas, it was kind of a little bit of elitist, and it never really jived at me, but I wanted to learn and I wanted to go out. And I remember the people who taught me in the beginning, I'm really grateful what they taught me, and I'm really grateful. That's it. And then I remember very shortly thereafter, I started taking courses at the AMGA, and then that just opened up my world of oh, there's a lot more.
And that exists now. And back then it really just didn't. And so there were so few climbers. It's hard to even begin to comprehend that there were so few climbers that even when I was climbing hard and doing the hardest climbs in the United States, people would ask me what I did. And I wouldn't say I was a climber because I'd always get that like, what? You're a climber? Like, why? It didn't even mean anything. So I would tell people I worked in the outdoor industry.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Just to shut them up.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I mean, my mother for a long time always thought I was crazy what I was doing working in a rock climbing gym. And then one year she did my taxes and she was like, oh, you actually make money. I was just like, Mom, what do you think I do? She was like, I just thought you were just being a bum.
Right.
She was like, like, don't all climbers just like smoke weed and just do hippie stuff?
My dad he understood it, but my mom did not like it at all. She was really disappointed.
Oh, really?
That I was, because I had dropped out of school. And remember, I had a conversation with her, and one of those conversations where she's like, Alan, we really need to talk to you. We're really worried about you. And I'm, what's going on? My mom said, you have no goals. You have no drive, no, no dedication to anything. And I'm like, are you kidding me? I have more goals and I'm more dedicated and I have more motivation and drive than anybody I know. Like, look at my lists of routes that I've checked off. And it's like, well, no, that's not, that's not what we're talking about. That's not going to lead anywhere. And so it is funny how just, again, it's just how the way that climbing absolutely exploded, because nobody now will, if you say you're a climber or you work in a climbing gym or own a climbing gym or whatever, or, nobody is going to question that. It's
no.
Okay.
Yeah. They're like, oh, it's a respectable industry.
Yeah. I think there's still parents who maybe wish their kids were doing other things.
I mean, it's like,
maybe, but there's always going to be that.
It's like that. Is it Bob Wills or or Willie Nelson? It's like, don't let your daughters or sons grow up to be cowboys. Have them be doctors or lawyers.
Yeah, Willie Nelson.
Yeah, Willie Nelson. There you go. Yeah. That's like the song that I always think of in my head when people are like, I just want to be a rock climber. And like their parents come up to me, and I'm a coach and I coach kids for a living. And their parents are like, does my child really have like a future to this? And that song always pops up in my head. And I'm like, you've listened to this one too many times. And
it is. And for me, like when just having climbing in the Olympics, I streamed. I was up at 4 a.m. or whenever it started. I watched every moment of it.
It was amazing
because I had just started. I'd met Adam Andre at Smith Rock, and I knew he was competing, and we became friends. So I had never really watched them before, and I could not look away. I watched every minute, and it was just like the coolest thing. Like, wow, somehow
that moment changed the world.
Somehow this sport that I was, I played a little role in, the development of it, and that decades later that it's, now it's in the Olympics and it's legit. This is a real thing. This is cool.
I remember watching that as well. And I was like, literally, I sat there, I was just looking at it. I'm like, rock climbing is forever different. Like at this exact moment, and I remember going to practice to the kids that I coached, and I was like, you guys don't understand this statement, and maybe when you're older you will, but like, how many of you watched the Olympics and rock climbing? And almost all of them raised their hand. Like, yeah, I had to get up super early. One kid is like, I recorded it and I watched it. And I was like, you are watching the changing of history. Like, and they're like, what? And I'm like, the only way I know how to describe it is it's like watching the formation of a new country or watching the formation of something amazing. Like, this is a pivotal moment in climbing history, and it is. And I think we'll see the true fruits of it in the next 5 to 10 years. But that moment, I'm happy that you brought it up.
Having the Olympics in Paris and then in Los Angeles, it's
changing.
Yeah, it's going to bring a lot more exposure.
Climbing gyms are about to explode. And so with that being said, I mean, they're already growing, exploding. I've heard, we briefly mentioned this yesterday in passing when we were talking, but like, how do you feel, or how are you helping your community manage like what people in my community are sometimes calling the coming swarm of people that are just going to be exploding into the climbing industry, exploding into the outdoor industry? Like, how do you feel about that coming up?
Well, it's happening. It's been happening because, again, when I was climbing at Smith Rock, a lot of times I'd be the only car in the parking lot all day. There were no climbers. And so I've seen it grow, and, there's a part of it. I have some mixed feelings, but then again, I know it's not about, if if right now, if nobody was interested in, you know, the old history of climbing, or it's like, oh yeah, I remember climbing, whatever happened to that sport? You know, if it would have just been a fad, I still would have loved what I did, but it would have been sad, you know, that like, wow, that's too bad that didn't make it. So for me, the fact that it has made it, I can totally put up with the downsides, the overcrowding, and, you know, it can be frustrating not being able to get a parking spot or waiting for a route, or having, you know, a group of kids on your autoblave, your project you're trying to do at the gym. Mm-hmm. But it's fine. It's actually great. I mean, just how it's become something that, you know, I loved it, and so many people love it now. And yeah, we'll see. I am involved. I've been involved with the state parks in Oregon, to working on climbing, you know, since like the 1980s, to kind of help the, you know, because I didn't own, of course, the land I was climbing and developing. And so I had to have a relationship with the park managers, and we had a really good relationship that it's worked for all these years. So it's been pretty important, but now they're doing a new master plan, and you have to, you know, you can't ignore the fact that it's, that climbing has become so popular that there's times and places where you need to get reservations, like to do El Cap or something. I don't think you can just go up there and climb it anymore.
No, I think they just initiated a permitting system or some kind of system recently. Like, I remember reading something. There's something that changed about the valley, like, because there's so many people.
Yeah, that's too bad. And something has to, I mean, that makes some sense that they have to do it.
Yeah, I mean, that place, especially for iconic places, I've been a big fan of, like, going to places that are off the beaten path, and that's it. And, like, you know, and I get that, like, those places are nice and still exist, but your iconic places, you are going to have to wait. You are going to have lines. But I also think that, you know, and, like, I know someone's going to hate me for saying this, and I just don't care. But, like, at the end of the day, like, it's a good problem to have, because it forces us to think in a grander, it forces us to stop thinking about ourselves in climbing and start thinking about our place and our role within the sport and within the community. And, like, okay, like, how are you going to manage this? How are you going to mitigate this? Like, this just can't be cowboyed anymore up. Like,
no, and that's if you look at it any other way, if you still have the cowboy approach, you can't do that anymore.
No.
You actually, like, I always said, I spent my whole climbing career outside at Smith Rock, kind of trying to dodge the rangers, and, you know, not going to ask them for permission. Like, hey, do you mind if I rappel down and hammer in these bolts and use chalk? And I just did it, you know? So, it's funny the way that, you know, at this point though, you have to, I was going to be doing something at the International Climbers Festival in Wyoming.
Oh, nice. Are you going this year?
Yeah, I'm a keynote speaker, and I'm hosting this Hill to Crag event where you're working with local politicians, you know, land use managers, that sort of stuff. And Tommy Caldwell has played a real role in that. And I was just talking to him the other day about how do you do that? But you kind of have to. You have to. I'm somebody who's not been very political and not very interested in all that sort of stuff, but I feel like I have a responsibility now to be involved, because I'm kind of an elder statesman now in the world of climbing. I
mean, your voice carries a lot of weight. And I mean, just like with, like, your repertoire alone, your voice will carry a lot more weight than even someone like me who's like, I want to come up. I mean, I've been in the climbing industry for a long time, but I haven't been in it long enough for people outside of this climbing world, outside in a political world or in a political spectrum, to probably even hear what I have to say. But between, like, you, Tommy, and people who have been at this basically since the dawn of it starting, in a more commercialized way,
right?
You know, I think, like, you just, that I can see why you'll carry a lot of weight, and I'm honestly happy that you do feel that it is your responsibility, because I think a lot of people would rather just sit in the silence and just sit back and be like, well, it's not the way that I want it to be anymore. It's not happening the way I want it to happen anymore. And so I'm not going to be a part of it. I'm not going to do anything. And I'm just going to.
And I kind of went through that period when I left climbing in the late 90s. And I kind of had, like, okay, that was great. That was fun, but I'm kind of done with it. I had injuries that were limiting me. And then I just realized I missed the climbing, but I missed the people more than anything else. And so now getting back into it, I just love talking about climbing. I just love talking about climbing. And I would rather, right now I was just telling a friend last night that I was, when I was in my 20s, the last thing I wanted to do was stand in front of a crowd and talk to people about climbing. Mm-hmm. And now, like, one of the last things I want to do is stand in front of a crowd and actually have people watch me climb, because I'm not, I got injuries and I'm getting old, but I love talking about climbing. I love speaking and talking about climbing. So that's, it's just your physical skills, they diminish over time, but then your wisdom and just your ability to connect with people, at least for me, it's grown, and that's not going to diminish. Even if I don't, going to the climbing gym and doing, especially the boulder problems, some of these new modern boulder problems that you kind of are jumping into. It's like,
They're different. It's different. Yeah. It's so different. I coach it for a living. And I can't tell you, the kids that are all the time, they're like, how do you do this boulder? I'm like, well, you do this. And I can get up and do some of them. But even then, sometimes I watch the kids do, and I'm like, do this thing. And then I always, like, every once in a while, I'm like, all right, I have a theoretical boulder I want you guys to try. I'm like, just humor me. And then they do it. And I'm just like, and another coach will lean over to me. He's like, did you think that was actually going to work? I'm like, I don't understand the physics of what they just did. I'm not going to lie. And I just told them to do it, and but it's what happens. And this is where climbing is going. It's getting so, like, competition climbing is just, it is so incredibly complex that, like, I was telling a parent about it, and they're like, what do you think is going to be the difference for kids in competition climbing? And when moving forward, is it going to be stronger? Is it going to be this? I'm like, no, it has nothing. I don't think strength is a part of it, but it is going to be the kids who are quick-witted and who can critically think fast, because the decision making, you watch some of these boulders, like, they're literally launching up, pressing, spinning in the air, counterclockwise, grabbing on something, and then still doing all of this stuff at once.
Yeah, it used to be you'd do a move, and then you'd look ahead, and then you'd set up, and you do the next move, and now it's just like bam, bam, bam. There's a whole sequence that you have to read and control your body swing and everything. It's really fun to watch, but it's so different that I know it's still my sport, but it is evolved so much that
I think that's the thing. Is the nice thing is like, and we can honestly say indoor climbing and outdoor climbing are going two entirely different ways. I do think the skills from indoor climbing are applicable to outdoor.
Sure.
And I don't think as many outdoor skills applicably transfer over to indoor climbing, but they still do benefit each other a little bit, but they are going two separate ways. And so in that way, like, I know you're operating within the indoor climbing ethos. Is most of your advocacy work or your work you're doing for the climbing industry as a whole, indoor and outdoors, or do you find yourself really what you are trying to do is talk about outdoor climbing?
I do more talking about outdoor climbing just because that's my background, but I am right now, if I describe my climbing, I'm a gym climber. I go indoors, I climb in gyms. The routes that I'm trying to do, they're routes that are there for 6 weeks or 2 months, the green route. And, that's what I'm doing. And so since I spend so much time in gyms, and people will eventually figure out, oh, well, you're the one who, did this or that. And so I meet a lot of people. And even in that context, I have a voice. And, so yeah, I feel like more now I can't just say, no, I focus on outdoor climbing, and indoor climbing is just this new thing that I don't, really support that much. I mean, I'm a gym climber, and it was a change when I realized, wow, there's people who actually get really good, like boulderers or something, who never actually even climb outdoors.
Yeah.
And at first, for a while, that kind of bothered me. And now anymore, it's like, well, yeah, that makes perfect sense. That's just, and it's totally legitimate. It's just the more our sport grows in different branches off in different directions, that makes, it's an Olympic sport. Why do you need to, you don't need to go outdoors. You don't
have to. You are correct.
I remember like watching in a World Cup, some Japanese climbers, and there was a hand jam that they didn't know how to hand jam. And Adam Ondra was there, and, he had just been like, doing the salapé. And it was just, it didn't look I mean, I think it was just a hand jam.
It was a hand jam.
But
That boulder was
if you
famous.
don't know how to do a hand jam. And so you could easily say like, oh, these guys, they can't even hand jam. But no, it's just, why would they? Now, of course, once that's a technique they have to learn, then of course they get.
Oh, now they know.
They know, and they get better than, really fast. But it's so legitimate, just this new angle of climbing. So I'm a spectator, but I just truly enjoy watching it.
You just made me realize, did you see the adjustable crack on the kilter wall down there?
I've heard about it.
It was the wildest thing. I went and pressed the button and I was like, I want a fist. And then I pressed it and I made it into a fist and it was like just blowing my mind. It's downstairs.
So
on the big giant kilter board.
The big giant one.
Yeah, all the way in the back left-hand corner. You see that thing that looks like almost like a barrel on the side left of it? That's an adjustable crack that you can make as wide, as small as you want. And the bottom half of it can be one width and the top half of it can be another width. Yeah. It's like, blows my mind.
Walking through like the kilter, like those boards are just, it's like this new thing that I didn't really know much about. And now it's like, oh my God, this is, You
realize, like, I bet you in the future, in the next 10 to 15 years, there's going to be completely modular gyms where you can be like, this month, all the walls are this angle.
Yeah. Well, there's a gym in Bend now that is just, I know there's several around the country that are just board-based gyms. And so all they have is kilter boards and moon boards, and some of those, I've
heard about this.
They're small, but you don't need a staff. The one in Bend is open 24 hours a day, and you just have your little pass. You get in the door and you have your app with the, and it's a great model because to rent that space is pretty inexpensive compared to a full climbing gym. And it's not for everybody, but for people who are more serious climbers, it's a great way to go. I mean, if I had the space in my house, and the money in my bank account, I would definitely buy one of those things.
No, it's a dream thing that I want in a home. You said something a few moments ago that kind of like really like touched my heart, and it made me super happy to hear, from one generation to another. It's like, I find that like a lot of older people, it's either they're not psyched on gyms. They're not psyched on gym community, or it's just like, it has to be one or the other. And the fact of the matter that you're kind of embracing it and just loving the communities that are in the gym. Cause I think that's one of the things that I like the most about indoor rock climbing gym is the communities are different. They're very different I don't think they're that different than an outdoor community, but they are in their own right. And I think it's really cool because the level of psych that people just have to be in the gym and just climb, and they're like, man, this is my thing. I'm doing this, and if those people ever get the gumption to just go outside, then their whole world just explodes, and then they just like light up. And so it's this really cool thing to watch. Like, you almost get to watch like the birth of two people happen. It's like they come into the gym and they're like, this is amazing. And they're climbing everything and they're having a field day. And if one day they get to go outside and then they climb outside and you're with them, then all of a sudden they're like, you've been having this and you've been holding out on me the whole time. And
and it's funny, but and it works the opposite way. Where you
really?
You've climbed outdoors for years and decades, and then you go into a modern gym and it's like, oh my God, this is the most amazing thing. So it works both ways. And a reason I've had the experience I truly enjoy climbing gyms. But another reason why I got so much crap from people being with starting the sport climbing thing and people not liking what I did, that I just decided I am never going to be that person. I'm never going to be, when climbing changes, I'm not going to be the person saying, oh, well, that's not the way we used to do it in my generation. And because, it would be hypocritical to do that because I know that I was creating waves and I wasn't especially well liked. And I've found it's just a way better approach, because if I would have had the attitude about climbing gyms, like, yeah, that's not real climbing, I would have missed out on just the wonderful I've made hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of trips to the climbing gym. And I actually, to be honest with you, I look back now over the routes that I've done in the last 5 years that I'm proudest about. They're all gym routes. The awesome. Green route and the blue route and the black route. And, but I have arthritis in my fingers. Smith is really crimpy.
Oh.
You can go to climb, for a couple hours. It just fits into my life better. And I've already done the outside thing so much that this is just this new world that I love.
That's awesome. I like I said before, I think it's unique, and I'm honestly extremely appreciative of it, because I find myself sometimes, even with people in my own age, creeping into early 40s, and a little younger than me, like, it's just like, there is still this kind of like occasional, like, I don't know whether they're called elitist or what mentality, but there is this mentality where it's just like, it's got to be one or the other. And I'm like, I don't know, the world just, in my opinion, like, that's not the way the universe works. It's not this or that. It's not one or the other. It's like, there are multiple truths, and multiple things can coexist at the same time and space. And I'm happy to know that, because, like, especially like with you, it's like I would be remiss if you didn't like it, because I'd be like, you have such a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of understanding of, like, with your relationships with, like, park rangers, communities, just climbing, and just sheer all just, like, I would say, like, climbing common sense of just, like, being in the environment a lot. Like, you're quick to see things, you're quick to notice things, and you're probably quick to see, like, oh, I've seen this wave happen before. I've seen this kind of attitude happen before, And it's not, I'm not necessarily saying, like, you're the police when saying like, okay, we shouldn't be doing this, but, like, you're able to advise, you're able to give counsel, you're able to do that. And I think not having that, and people who have been in this sport, whether it's indoors or outdoors or wherever you are, but if you've been in this in a while and you're wanting to just, like, gatekeep all that information, like, in the long run, you're really doing a disservice to the community.
I agree with you. And climbing, for me, if I think back to what climbing was in the 70s when I started and what it is now, climbing is it's a better sport than it was back then. Even starting the sport climbing thing, the critics were saying, well, no, that's cheating. That doesn't count. And all I was saying is, no, I'm not trying to say that trad climbing and crack climbing shouldn't exist. Just there's room for another branch on the tree. And so now it is branched in so many directions that I never, ever imagined, and continues to go in directions. Just the adjustable, the crack thing that you were just talking about, and all of these these walls that tilt and move, and but that's made the sport overall just way better, because it's not like one new thing. It's not like, oh, well, now there's adjustable walls, so you can't really, gym climbing kind of goes away, or sport climbing. Everything still exists that was there before.
It just adds.
It just adds to it.
Yeah. I remember the first time I saw a modular climbing wall. It's not something that can tilt, but you can actually, like, shape the angles of the wall so it can be smooth, S-shaped, bulgy, this. And I remember the first time I saw that, and I was like, what in the world is this? And it was at that moment that I realized I agree with you. I'm like, there is so much room for this sport to grow, in a way, in a professional standpoint and an industry standpoint. I guess one thing is, I'm hoping that, like, the community and, like, the efficacy, I don't know if I'm saying this right, but, like, I'm just hoping the community grows in the same pace, or it keeps up with it, or is growing in the same way of, like, bringing people into the sport and making it more accessible.
Yeah, and that is kind of our responsibility. I mean, the people that have been climbing, I mean, it's your responsibility and mine, and any of us who have been around a long time, because people do, we're more mentors right now than, cutting edge climbers. But that's a really important role. So, I don't know, it seems to me like that is getting addressed pretty well. It's not like the new climbers that are coming into the sport are just, I'm always just amazed. They just seem to be, like, a lot of really good, nice people, like people that I just, whether they're I have friends that are 15 years old that I, exchange texts with. It's like, hey, I did this route, and, that sort of thing. And I don't know. It seems like something about climbing attracts a certain type of person, and it weeds out some people that climbing's hard. It's hard work, and it can be scary, and there's just something about it that it's almost like a litmus test that to get through and actually be a climber, you have to, you have to push yourself. You have to really want it. It's not just just feel good, sit back and do nothing and just have a feel good experience. It's kind of hard.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I think the community does do a good job of not so much like weeding out, but also helping people grow. Because the reason why I say this is I'm reminded of a kid that started rock climbing in our gym years ago. I never coached him. He was just a kid that refused to be coached. But he would come into the gym, lose his temper, scream and yell, kick the gym. And it was never me or staff. It was members that I would always go up to him like, hey, man, like, can we kind of help you and do this and kind of work? And then like, he's a different person.
Yeah.
now.
And no, it's a good way to look at it because it is helping them grow. It's not weeding them out. And it's like, oh, well, you just don't have what it takes to be a climber. You have people that are really rough and, and then they grow and then a lot of these people, I mean, I remember climbers, that are now fairly old climbers. And I remember when they were 15 years old and they were the people that I was saying, hey, that fits you through on the rock and screaming and, you need to just calm that down a little bit.
Yeah.
But now they've grown into, we all do that. We all have things, in our past that we look back and thinking, that wasn't me at my best.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you because I don't want to take too much of your time. And I definitely would love to visit you out in Smith Rock and out in your neighborhood in the wood. And it looks like I saw on the sign rolling by, it looks like next year's CWA is going to be in your hood.
Yeah, it is. And I'm trying to get involved with the show. And I will. Yeah, you should definitely.
I will come. I will be there.
I would be honored to take you out to Smith Rock or whatever, and that would be so much fun. Yeah,
I'll be so psyched. And then if there's anything I can do to help you, you please let me know because I just saw it up on the screen. So in a minute, I'm going to text message my boss. May 17th through 19th, I need off.
Yeah, I was really happy to see that.
Yeah. So, but if people want to find you and support you. Buy your guidebooks, buy anything that you published or anything, like where can they do to go that, where can they go online to do that or in person?
Yeah, I haven't really had much of a presence. I do have a website now called wattsrocks.xyz that's just kind of getting developed and where I'm hoping to tell stories and just, it's my connection to the new generations of climbers. And I'm not on any social media at this point, but that will probably come. I just kind of missed that whole thing, and now
it's easy to do. Don't worry, you'll catch up fast. Okay, and then I guess, is there anybody you want to give a shout out to, say hello to, or anything like that?
I don't know. For me, I'm grateful for just everybody, all the climbers, the whole community, and I can't even express it enough is how, as I get older, I know I am not going to be lonely. As long as I'm, if I can take my walker into a climbing gym or down to the crag or whatever, there'll always be community for me. And that's what I'm most grateful for.
Well, I'm extremely appreciative that you have decided to take ownership over this and take ownership over climbing like you did, taking ownership and having drive and discipline when you were explaining to your mom that you were super disciplined with all these routes and everything that you've done. And it seems like you've transferred that same energy over to the climbing community. And as someone who has spent a big portion of their career coaching young people and traveling to gyms just to see what, I'm just used to living in a bubble and I know the world doesn't exist and I've gone to things. I would say your mindset and your dedication to this is not as common as you think. And I hope that anyone listening to this podcast would understand that we all have a responsibility and we all should step up and do it a little bit. And you don't have to be the biggest cheerleader in the room, but you do need to just be willing to give someone a high five. And that's generally,
and I recognize as I get older that really I need climbing still more than climbing needs me. Oh. I mean, I need climbing. I need that community. And so that's why it's not just purely trying to be a good person by being involved.
I get that.
A lot of it is I get so much out of it. Yeah. Just doing this podcast with you has been wonderful.
Well, thank you for your time and I appreciate you.
All right.
Mr. Alan Watts, dropping nothing but love and gratitude and joy to be in this sport, which we all love. Thank you so much for listening to Sends and Suffers podcast. And if you are listening to the very tail of this and you're a real one, then know that I will be dropping short
little segments of me talking about my time in Malawi coming up with Genevieve Walker, Liz, and Scott. This thing was an amazing trip, and I am so grateful that GCI was able to put this together and organize this whole thing. And if you don't know what GCI is, make sure you check it out. I'm rambling. I'm going to get out of here. As always, remember, if you're not suffering, you got to ask yourself, are you really even sending at all? I mean, is it worth it?